Okay, let's try and make a start. My name is Dimitris Papadimitriou. I'm the director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. And for those of you who are new to our events, let me say that the Centre over the past few years has been very active in promoting greater understanding on issues affecting the European Union and Europe more broadly. In the past, our annual lectures and special events have attracted high-profile speakers from across Europe, and we take very seriously our responsibility to engage with public debate, and there is no issue that nowadays dominate the media, and no issue of greater importance than the future of British membership of the European Union. You know, there is a referendum coming up on the 13th of June. A centre like ours has taken a lead in many ways in promoting discussion from many different angles on this issue, and it is for this reason that today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Will Straw, who will give our annual lecture for this year. Will is the Chief Executive of the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. It is an umbrella organisation that supports British membership, the continuation of British membership of the European Union. Will, therefore, is very well placed to give us an insight into this whole debate. He has himself substantial experience on policy matters. He's been involved in government for a number of years. He has also got a long-standing interest with the Northwest, so we're very pleased to welcome him here. The weather is not great, but you are familiar with this, that's fine. It's much harder for me than you. Just before I give the floor to Will, let me just say that Will will start with a short talk of 15 minutes, and then we will both sit down and invite you to ask questions. We encourage as many questions from you as possible from whatever perspective you come from. On the right of the screen you will see a number of themes that we hope to structure the discussion around. So if you have questions that fall under each of these categories, please wait for your turn. I will be asking people to contribute with questions, but before all of that, let me just give the floor to Will, and thanks again for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitris, for that kind invitation, and I think fitting to be here at the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. Jean Monnet, that great French diplomat and statesman, one of the founding fathers of the European Union, and the president of the European Coal and Steel Community all that time ago. How would he feel that this debate was taking place and we could be just 2 months away from Britain pulling out of the European Union, with all the consequences that would follow? And indeed, Andreas Kanaris, who lends his name to this lecture theatre, a Cypriot nuclear physicist who studied at the University of Manchester and then devoted his life to travel, setting up Delta Travel. How would he feel about the prospect that visas could be reimposed on people in the UK to travel to Europe, to travel to the place of his birth in just the coming weeks and months? Because this referendum presents our country with the biggest decision we will make in a generation. The question in front of us is what's best for Britain, whether to take a leap into the dark and leave the EU, or build a Britain with a more confident, more secure and stronger future. The decision will have profound consequences for our national character, our security, global influence and economic strength. The decision we make will affect generations to come. And remember, this decision is final. If we leave, we leave. That's it. Today I'm setting out the positive and patriotic case for remaining in the European Union, but my experience shows you have to look at both sides of the argument and ask searching questions of your opponents too. If we choose to remain on June 23rd, we will retain our ability to shape international cooperation over development, human rights, intelligence sharing and security, climate change, global commerce, peacekeeping, the behaviour of multinational companies, and working people's rights. In a complex and fast-changing world, when the defining decisions are taken, Britain will remain at the table. There is, as yet, no credible alternative argument for relinquishing our power, and merely a fantasy where there should be an alternative credible proposition. The world is watching with incredulity that our country, which has left an indelible mark on history and given the world some of its greatest scientific, artistic, intellectual and industrial achievements, is seriously considering leaving rather than leading, choosing isolation over influence. Let's just run through those positive benefits that we get from being in the European Union. In Europe, our economy is stronger. More than 3 million jobs in this country are linked to our trade with the EU. Being a member of the EU's single market, our home market of 500 million consumers, gives us full access to European goods and services markets, tariff-free trade and therefore lower prices, and an equal say in setting the rules of doing business in that entire market. This would be lost if we left. Some sectors, such as the automotive industry, which employs 700,000 people, are particularly reliant on EU exports. And we get a huge amount of investment from European countries too, around £24 billion a year. All in all, being in the EU is equivalent to around £3,000 per year for every household in the country, which is a return on investment of our net contribution of about 10 to 1. All those benefits from the low prices, jobs, investment and growth clearly outweigh the costs. And working people are also better off because European law provides important protections at work, such as paid holidays, protections from bullying and harassment, and parental leave too. And in Europe we have a stronger national security as well. Many of the threats that we face are global in nature, such as terrorism, cross-border crime and climate change. And whether it's implementing sanctions against Russia, sharing intelligence about terrorists, or arresting criminals using the European arrest warrant, being in Europe makes us safer. Simply put, there is strength in numbers in an era where international cooperation brings us more power and more influence. And we have stronger leadership in the world as well. In this complex international environment in which we live, we have more control over our destiny by staying inside organisations like the EU. We'd never dream of leaving the United Nations or NATO, so why contemplate leaving the EU? If we want Britain to be a leader in the world, we need to be in Europe, helping to take the big decisions. At our best, Britain has always been outward-looking, engaged in our continent, and leading in Europe. And in Europe, young people have better prospects too. There are great opportunities for work, travel and study across Europe. Take the Erasmus programme, which funds the Centre of Excellence. Over 200,000 UK students and 20,000 university staff have spent time abroad and on the Erasmus exchange programme. Each year the number of students who go on Erasmus increases. And there'll be around 120,000 students who take on the programme between 2015 and 2020. And why is this so important? It's not just great life experience for those young people. There's also an economic return. Students who have undertaken placements on the Erasmus programme are 50% less likely to experience long-term unemployment than their counterparts. By being in Europe, enabling young people to put their global outlook into practice, we're making our economy stronger too. Which brings me to another debate in this campaign, which we must not duck: immigration. We must recognise people's concerns. As someone who stood as a candidate for the Labour Party and had numerous conversations, I know how deeply held people's concerns are. And we want fairness in our immigration system, not a free-for-all. People from other European countries and further away should not be allowed to access benefits until they've paid into the system. But those who come here, work hard, pay their taxes, contribute to our society and support our public services. We must never join the race to the bottom of attacking migration. There are 100,000 European nationals working in our health and social care system. 1.5 million people are employed in businesses that are owned by EU citizens. And European citizens have contributed £20 billion more in taxes than they've taken out in benefits. The facts are clear. The overwhelming majority of EU citizens in Britain are contributors and not freeloaders. Those who want to pull us out of Europe and end free movement should be careful what they wish for. We would lose our access to the world's largest free trade area, the single market, costing us jobs and pushing up prices. Andreas Kanaris would be turning in his grave as we would compromise opportunities for Brits to work, study, travel and retire freely in Europe. And we could see our border checks moving from Calais to Dover, as our Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of France has warned. So let's ensure fairness, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there are other risks if we leave too. Britain would be weaker, with less influence in the world, and more vulnerable, having sacrificed arrangements that keep us safe. Ask yourself if you are comfortable with the fact that NATO says we are safer in Europe, but President Putin wants us to leave. I know whose side I'm on. A number of major reports published recently outline the economic danger too. PricewaterhouseCoopers have warned of a potential cost to our economy of £100 billion and 950,000 jobs lost by 2020. Oxford Economics has estimated over £40 billion in cuts could be needed, devastating public services, and undoubtedly exacerbating the north-south divide. The London School of Economics have shown that the long-term cost of the economy could be a hit to the tune of 9% of GDP. And then, just last week, the UK government, taking a more cautious approach, suggested that the economy would shrink by 6%, equivalent to £4,300 on average to households in the UK, and leading to public spending cuts of 36 billion or an increase in income tax of 8p in the pound. Others, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the OECD, have warned of damage to inward investment, credit ratings downgrades, substantial losses to sterling, resulting in interest rates and inflation. Collectively, these warnings are conclusive and devastating. Britain would be permanently worse off. Many studies show the only way of reducing the risk is to continue with current levels of immigration from the European Union, the very thing that Leave campaigners have set themselves against. As the Free Market Open Europe think tank has said, the path to prosperity outside the EU lies through free trade and opening up to low-cost competition, maintaining relatively high immigration and pushing through deregulation. That may sound desirable for some within the Leave campaign, but it's not my vision of a better Britain, a better society. But let's not forget the views of those leading lights in the Leave campaigns. Nigel Lawson, who chaired the Vote Leave campaign, runs a think tank dedicated to denying the existence of climate change. Ian Duncan Smith campaigned against the social chapter of workers' rights. Boris Johnson wants to increase charges on the NHS. Nigel Farage has said he would axe race discrimination laws. And many of their campaigners even opposed the national minimum wage. Whatever they propose, we can be assured that they do not have the best interests of British workers or society's most vulnerable in mind. And those campaigning to leave need to come clean about what would happen if we do so. In any election, the test of a credible candidate is a credible economic alternative. But they have, as far as I can see, given up all pretense of running a campaign with a convincing competing argument about the future of our economy. The alternatives they have proposed underline the weakness of the case for leaving. Some have said we could follow Norway or Switzerland, but that means you give away even more sovereignty, continue to pay into the EU budget, accepting free movement and EU legislation, but with absolutely no say over the EU rules. Before he was against it, Boris Johnson talked of Britain having a Canada-style trade deal, but this offers only partial access to the EU single market, excluding financial services and many other service sectors, with tariffs and quotas for vital products, including agricultural products such as beef. Nigel Lawson has said we could simply trade using World Trade Organization rules. This would mean tariffs on most British goods, 15% on food, 10% on cars, 12% on clothing. And each percentage point means higher costs for businesses and consumers. He said that a 4% import tariff was trivial. But ask a business person if a single percentage point increase has an increase on their planning, their workforce, or their stability. It is perhaps a paradox for Vote Leave that the alternative which offers the most distance from the EU and is therefore closest to their campaign's purpose, this WTO option, is the one that would do most damage to our economy. Extraordinarily, Michael Gove has suggested that Britain could follow Albania's economic arrangements with Europe. That means no access to services, no tariffs on agricultural goods, and zero influence. And not even Albania wants that deal. As their Prime Minister wrote in the Times on Tuesday, they're trying to join the single market that Michael Gove wants to leave. Let's be clear, Leave campaigners won't admit what they want because they know we already have the best deal on offer. I sometimes think they're a bit like a car salesperson who comes to you and says, you know, your car's really rubbish. Why don't you give me £10,000 and I'll get you a much better car? And you say, okay, that sounds interesting. What have you got in mind? And they say, well, I don't know exactly, but to promise you it'll be better. Come back to me and it'll all be fine. You just wouldn't buy a car on that basis. And understandably enough, you feel like you're being conned. And that, I think, is what's going on at the moment with the Leave campaign in this referendum. It is a con, what they're trying to sell us. They won't tell you what Britain would be like outside the EU, because they know we'll be weaker and worse off. So they keep telling you how terrible the EU is, and pushing you just to trust them with nothing real to back it up. So there is a choice in this campaign between prosperity on the one hand and uncertainty on the other, between strength and weakness, between confidence and retreat. There's nothing patriotic about turning a blind eye to credible economic warnings. Just as there's nothing patriotic about saying we are unable to hack it in a club that is big enough for 27 others, but not for the United Kingdom. The politics of division and separation fundamentally hinder our ability to progress in an increasingly interconnected world. Today, economic power is proportional to the strength of your international alliances, not the strength of your rhetoric against a fictitious Brussels bogeyman. The weight of evidence tells us that we would be better off and stronger remaining in the European Union. With a determination to lead and reform, we can help shape our future rather than finding ourselves isolated on the sidelines. And with a campaign that unites trade unions, businesses and charities, political parties from across the divide, and people of all ages, backgrounds and regions, our campaign will make the case that we should have confidence in ourselves, confidence in our country, and vote to remain stronger, safer and better off in Europe than we would be on our own. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. We are coming to the first sort of theme of our discussion, which is this broadly defined issue of sovereignty that seems to be very important for many people. I could perhaps start the discussion by asking you whether you thought that the calling of the referendum was a mistake or not. And let's take a few more questions, and perhaps you can group them and then you can... Anyone who would like to come?
Shall I start on that while people
Yeah.
warm up?
Sure.
I personally think it was right to have a referendum. I was actually one of the first people on the left to call for a referendum. In 2012, I wrote a pamphlet for an organisation called the Institute of Public Policy Research, where I used to write. And the reason for that, as you can see, I don't want to leave the EU. But it felt to me, particularly from all the various canvassing I'd done for the Labour Party, that there was a strong desire for a referendum, which had been built on the promises of a referendum on the euro, which of course didn't happen because the case was never put, on the Lisbon Treaty, which didn't happen, debates in various manifestos about the need for referendums if we were to have future treaty change. So the idea had been bubbling around for a long time. And my generation and the generation slightly older and the generation younger had never had a chance to have a say on this institution, which had changed hugely in the 40 years since there was last a referendum. And I think because of that, it is important to have a renewed mandate. And what's been interesting about this referendum so far is that it's provided an opportunity for those of us who are pro-European to make a positive argument about the EU, something that I think has been missing from public discourse for a generation. We've heard plenty from the other side about what they dislike about the EU, aided and abetted by their friends in the tabloid press. But governments of both colours have used the EU as a bit of a whipping boy, and I think that's been a great pity. So, if nothing else, this referendum has forced pro-Europeans to make the case, and it is obviously a slightly high stakes game. But I do think we will prevail, and I think there will then be a renewed mandate for our position in Europe. hopefully it will silence some of the critics.
There's a question.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to just go back at what you just said, because I think there are many political scientists and policymakers that strongly disagree with you on this point. But there was no need to push for the referendum, that this was a fatal flaw, okay? And that actually both the general population was not ready, did not have the right information leading up to the referendum, and therefore it's questionable whether the civic education program actually happened. And second of all, this last point that you made, that it was the chance for those of us who have a positive view of the EU to present a strong argument. And I would like to take that and ask you, do you think that the Remain campaign has done a good job at presenting this positive? Because watching this campaign, I've heard much more of the incorrect negative rhetoric over and over again than I've heard a cohesive and strong positive message. So.
Well, let me take the second part first, because I do think that we've been making a positive and patriotic case. It partly depends where you look. As a campaign, you have three main channels of communication. You have the mainstream media, who twist and distort everything that you do and are only really interested in risks and rows. So a politician making a 20-minute speech that covers the positive case of being in and the risks of leaving, as I've done just now, will only have the risks reported. So that's not always the best lens through which to watch this debate. They have their own agenda. Secondly, there is the social media channels that we have, which we control completely. And I think if you look at what we've done on Facebook and Twitter, you will see much more balance, indeed more on the positive side than on the negative side, setting out the positive case again and again, but not being afraid to set out the risks. It's very important that we do that. I don't think it's incorrect at all to set out the risks of leaving. In fact, it's one of the things that sharpens people's minds. And as a political scientist, I assume you're a political scientist, I'm sure you'll have read Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow. And over the decades of studies that he did, in a sense, creating behavioural economics, he showed that people are much more loss averse than they are grateful for the things that they receive. Simple experiments like asking people to give somebody a mug and ask them what they would take to sell it, and asking them what they would buy the same mug for. And the price is much greater for what they would sell it for, because people don't want to lose something. So I think it is absolutely right that we set out the risks as well as the positive benefits. And then there's the third set of things that we do, which is talking to people face to face or over the phone, where we are corralling thousands and thousands of people who feel passionately about being in the EU, each of whom have an opportunity to put it in their own words. There's no script, we're not telling people what to say, we'll give them the leaflets that have a mixture of positives and risks, but it's up to them how they want to frame their conversation. So I think over the course of this campaign, and let's not forget that we're only getting started, there's still 2 months to go, most people will have seen things on the TV and in the newspapers. If they're on social media, as half the population is, they probably will have seen something from us. And hopefully, they will have interacted with people who care about the issues. And I think over the course of the campaign, there will be a good mix of the positives and the risks, and certainly a lot more than if we hadn't had the referendum in the first place.
Any more questions on topic in the back?
Hi. You said that the opposition won't say what it will look like, because they know that we would be weaker if we left. So why are they pushing for it? What do they consider the benefits?
I think that's a great question, because I sort of look at this. You've got these people. I don't disparage them. They're passionate about their issue in the way that others of us are passionate about climate change or social justice. They're passionate about it. They've had 20, 25 years to prepare for this moment, and when it happens, the lock was there. It's like pulling back the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. They just haven't thought through the case, and I think it's partly because there's a sort of echo chamber of Eurosceptics who've been talking among themselves for year after year, winding each other up about what are relatively small things like individual regulations or things that none of us would like the European Parliament moving to Strasbourg once a month. They're irritants. But they haven't actually thought through what the economic case would be for leaving. or what their response would be to some of these major interventions that have been made by people like the General Secretary of NATO saying we'd be safer if we stayed inside, or President Obama saying, look, if you leave, you might get a trade deal with us, but to the back of the queue. So I think it's a fundamental weakness on their side, and what's been interesting in this debate is that they started off in October when Vote Leave, who are the designated campaign, in the sense our opponents are Britain Stronger in Europe, they set off saying they were going to make an economic case about branching out in the world and trading more with other countries. But just at the start of this week, following that barrage of criticism that they had from different organisations like the IMF and the Treasury and President Obama, they did a relaunch on Monday talking about immigration. I think trying to scare people. I think trying to abandon any prospect of having an economic case in order to put immigration back on the agenda. But you're probably better off asking when you move.
One more. Let's take a couple more over there. We'll take them as a group, and then you can.
Alex Salmon and I think Nicola Sturgeon as well have both recently said that if the UK as a whole were to vote to leave Europe and Scotland, the Scottish population were to vote to remain, that would trigger an inevitable second Scottish referendum. What implications do you think the EU referendum has for Britain's sovereignty within the United Kingdom?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great question. I don't know if it's inevitable. I mean, there's no constitutional trigger for a second Scottish independence referendum, but it will clearly drive up the agenda. And as you say, they've both been talking about it, other people have been talking about it as well. John Major, William Hague, Tony Blair have all referred to this in recent months. And I think the case would be quite hard to defend against. So you could end up with a prospect where not only did we leave the European Union, but the United Kingdom fell apart as well. And there's consequences for other parts of our United Kingdom. In Northern Ireland, I visited Belfast recently, there are huge worries about the erection of a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, because if you wanted to stop people from the EU coming into our country, that would mean stopping people from Ireland coming in as well, and putting border checks in place to manage the flow of trade across the border. Something that has ended in recent years because of the peace process, because of the coming together of communities. So there are really profound implications from leaving that I don't think we always hear enough about and can't actually be certain about. But perhaps it's that uncertainty that should worry us about taking that leave.
Hi. Just two kind of points really. You mentioned the positive campaign presented on social media. And just in light of, I did a bit of campaigning with Labour and a lot of stuff in terms of social media was done there, but it was actually something of an echo chamber, and the feedback you were getting was that from the, how do you say, the converted, preaching to the converted. Given that Britain First, which I would call a fascist organisation, is the most successful group on social media, i.e. has more followers than our Prime Minister, how effective do you think social media is, and does it not simply send back what you wish to hear? And on a second point, with regard to the polls as they currently reflect, it doesn't look like there will be a major victory, even if we do win it, one way or the other. It's quite close. Do you consider this to be final? Because I fear that given the normative orientation of those opposed, whatever the result, the argument will continue, and this won't resolve, I fear, the issues of sovereignty in our relationship with Europe, because it hasn't actually really done an adequate positive argument for maintained membership, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
I think on social media, you have to break it down between the different channels, and as somebody who stood for Labour, I think we put too much emphasis on Twitter, which is used by about 20% of the population. It's actually quite important in terms of setting the agenda with journalists in Westminster, but is not a great tool for communicating with the wider public. Facebook, by comparison, is used by 55% of the population. It's where a very large chunk of people get all of their news and information. They don't watch the BBC, they don't read a paper. It all comes from Facebook. And consider this, the Electoral Commission published this expenditure of the different political parties recently. Labour spent £16,000 on Facebook. The Conservatives spent £1.6 million on Facebook. And what they did, working with an American consultant called JMCE, is to target their most effective messages at specific people on Facebook using demographic characteristics by tracking where people lived and the information they put about themselves on Facebook. This is something that is very, very common now with companies. It's why you get those little adverts appearing on Facebook. So when I set up this campaign last summer, one of the first things I did was to hire the guys who worked for the Tories on their social media strategy. And the second thing I did was hire Jim Messina, the American consultant, so that I could make sure that my campaign didn't make the same mistakes that Labour had made in the 2015 election, and that we made sure that our social media campaign was not an echo chamber and was reaching out to people who were undecided, and that we would try to get them through social media, because perhaps we couldn't through the mainstream media. So that's what we're doing at the moment. In terms of the question about the polling, it's sort of hard to know, isn't it? I mean, you know, my objective is to win this referendum, keep us in the EU, and frankly, I'd settle for 50% plus one. But I mean, you know, if you're offering me a 70-30 win, I'll take it. I think we know that there will be a group of people who will be dissatisfied if we leave. And indeed, you can see in some ways how the Leave campaigners think they're now losing the argument, and so are starting to whinge about the process. They're starting to say that it's not fair. It wasn't fair that the government sent out information about the referendum, which they've done for every referendum going back to the 70s. You know, it isn't fair that the government's able to produce these reports even though they've got a clear position, and so on and so forth. But my hope is that as the campaign goes on, and I would stress to people, I mean, you've all come, I presume, because you're interested in this issue, but you are odd, if I may say, compared to most people who are still not engaged in this referendum, and I'm the oddest of all for having taken a job working on this campaign and immersing myself in it every single day. Most people haven't switched on yet. Indeed, we had a focus group just this week, as we do most weeks, where nobody in the room even knew there had been a renegotiation, which of course was the main political event on Europe in February. So I think that as people engage in the debate, as they start to really ponder the question and consider the arguments, that we will open up a bigger bit. And I hope that that will be inclusive. But as I say, I just want to...
Can we perhaps move on to the economic side of the argument, and then we can come back to any unanswered questions at the end. I just want to make sure that we cover most ground here. On the economy, well, you made a convincing case about the overall benefits of EU membership for the British economy. But at the same time, we know that those on lower income and those living in the UK's most deprived areas are less likely to support the EU. Don't they know what's going on? Why is it that somehow all these arguments about the EU protecting rights, protecting investment and so on, doesn't resonate with people who are in the most difficult circumstances?
I think there's a backlash taking place in Britain and many other countries as well. We see it in America in the context of the primary elections. There's a backlash against globalisation. It's a backlash against the way that people who gain greater skills enjoy greater rewards in later life, and that people who left school at 16 and have seen the industry that their parents and grandparents would have worked in declining, seen their prospects limited, while those who have been to university or done postgraduate studies have horizons that get greater and greater. And I think our public policy response to that has been flawed. We have not put in place the policies to ensure that people are able to reskill and get the training that they need. We've not done enough to support communities that have been decimated by successive governments' policies. We've not done enough, perhaps, to ensure that we're supporting people in finding work with an industrial policy that means that jobs are brought to areas that still have workforces hungry to get on in life, but don't have any industry nearby. I don't think we've done enough to ensure that our labour markets are properly regulated so that people can't be exploited. And indeed, I don't think we've done enough to ensure that proper minimum standard is put in place for people coming into this country, with the enforcement of the minimum wage and cracking down on gangmasters. I think all these things have contributed to the dissatisfaction that many people from a poorer background have, not just with Brussels, but with Westminster and politics in general. And that's all very complicated, and quite a convenient person to blame or group to blame are migrants or the European Union. And I think that's been allowed to build up over years because there's not been an adequate response to it. There have not been politicians who've been willing to set out clearly what the case is for migration, what the case is for the European Union. And indeed, perhaps the European Union's not done quite enough to sell itself. Actually, the EU has contributed hugely in this country to more deprived areas through its cohesion funds. But when you go around Europe and see those EU flags flying across infrastructure projects and so on, you don't see them here. I'm always struck, because I'm now looking out for it, going into buildings, whether it's the Sharp project in Manchester, or children's centres and welfare to work centres across Lancashire and the North West. There'll be a tiny plaque at the entrance with the EU flag, but nothing more visible. So I think the EU and perhaps UK policy towards expressing the EU's role has not been adequate enough. And that's again why I think this referendum is important. It's important for us to make that case. One of the positive things that we've been seeking to do in this referendum is setting out all the examples of EU investment into this country. The many projects like the Angel of the North and the Egypt in Cornwall, all the different social projects, what it's done for the waterfront in Liverpool, many projects in Manchester that receive those in London, highlighting those, getting them written up in the local papers, getting local MPs and councillors to visit those sites, putting it on leaflets and sharing it on social media. But there's such a long way to go in sharing that information and helping people to understand that actually if we were to retreat, it would make things worse. I'm quite convinced of the hidden agenda of those who want to leave the EU, but also how much worse it would be in terms of job losses and price rises if we were to leave. So it's such a complicated thing to get under the bonnet of, but I think there's so much more to do, but leaving the EU would just exacerbate things and make them worse.
As a Labour politician, are you comfortable with the austerity paradigm that seems to be governing the EU government?
Well, I'm a failed politician. I tried to get away to work out, and obviously I'm not speaking in my capacity as the head of this project. I mean, that's a matter of record thought, as many people did, that the cuts in the last Parliament were too far and too fast. But I think what is clear is that if we left the EU and there was suddenly this black hole in our public finances because of by losing access to the single market, because of the loss of trade, because of the loss of jobs in many of our most trade-exposed industries, for all those reasons, it'd be a big hit to public finances, and then we would face a second era of austerity, and I think that would really put our public services on their knees even more than they are now. So that is a reason people won't be doing others to stay in Europe.
Sure. Is there a question?
I think this might be a good point just to press you on a couple of points regarding sort of these austerity paradigm. And something which has been sort of conspicuous by its absence, and you didn't address it in your talk, is this idea that Labour's pushing of this social Europe. Right? It seems to me a bit of a fallacy that a social Europe has been the aim of every social democratic party since the 1970s, give or take. And there hasn't been a great deal of progress towards it. So what reforms exactly does Labour actually want to see, especially in light of sort of the institutional setup of the EU, sort of the drive towards competitiveness and the fiscal rules and the ECB and the inflation cap and so on and so forth. So how does Labour intend to push for this social Europe? What does it want it to actually look like? And then I guess the second point I'd like to press you on is that what are the implications of Brexit for the Labour Party? In that, with the current Labour leadership, which is, despite its public declarations, the most Eurosceptic Labour leadership since the 1970s, where does Brexit then leave the Labour Party? Does it lend itself to this sort of narrative they're trying to construct of renationalisation of certain industries and so on and so forth? So where does Labour go in that event?
mean, just to sort of say at the start, obviously I'm not here to speak about the Labour Party. Let me just give you a personal perspective, my sort of views on what you've set out. The first thing is that in 1975 the Labour Party was fundamentally split on the EU. There were those who were in favour of the common market, but there were many people who were opposed to it. The cabinet was split, I think 2-1 in favour. There was a big revolt on the backbenches, similar in fact to the way the Conservative Party is split now. In 1983 the Labour Party's policy was to leave the European Union. And then Jacques Delors came and spoke at the Trade Union Conference in 1988 and set out this vision of social Europe, of a European Union that combined the common market with a common set of standards for workers across Europe to prevent what he termed social dumping, the idea that in one country people could have much worse labour standards than another, allowing for cheaper overall production costs. And that vision became European policy in the social chapter. Famously, John Major got an opt-out from it in 1992 to partly buy off his sceptics in his party. And then Tony Blair committed Labour to adopting the social chapter in 1997, and that has been the backstop for many of the rights that we enjoy, including paid holidays, maternity and paternity leave, legislation against bullying and harassment. All of these things that we now enjoy are because of EU legislation. There's a debate about what would happen if we left. You know, would they immediately be lost? No. But is there a section of the Conservative Party that would try to take it away? Yes, we know there was. They had a report in the last Parliament where they sought to do much of that, and you can read what people like Boris Johnson and Ian Duncan Smith have said in the past. So it absolutely provides a backstop, and it is there. What else could we do? Well, some of the things that the EU is already doing, I think, are very important. So the move away from agricultural subsidies towards expenditure on research and investment, making sure that universities are able to do the research for the jobs of tomorrow, providing opportunities for everyone, I think is absolutely critical. Making sure that we tackle climate change is something that we know will affect the most vulnerable and poorest more than anyone. So I think that's critical as well. We've got a huge amount that we need to do as a continent to cope with ageing populations and people that, in order to get on in life, need in many cases to have both parents working and therefore adequate childcare. Are there things that we could think about doing across the EU, or best practice sharing from one country to another so that we can emulate the best in European countries like Scandinavia? Those are all things that I personally would support. Others in the coalition that I'm running would not. In terms of the Labour Party, there is something very striking about this referendum, which is the unity that is in place. Over 90% of Labour MPs supporting Alan Johnson's Labour In campaign. There are only about half a dozen who are not. I understand that people are speculating about Jeremy Corbyn's position, but I mean, the guy won a Labour leadership contest because of his authenticity, because of the fact he wasn't willing to say things he didn't believe. And I think what's possibly happened is that the coalition that elected him as Labour leader was made up of some fellow travellers from the far left of the Labour Party and very, very engaged young people who were fed up with the Labour leadership and wanted something that was different. But they had the same views as him on some issues, like Trident, for example, but different views on the EU. And I speculate, but I wonder whether over the course of that leadership contest, hearing from young people about why the EU mattered to them helped him to change his views and come to the position he has. And he was quite careful during the leadership contest. He certainly never said during the leadership contest he wanted to pull away from the EU. The last times that he had said that were some years before. So I think he's genuine about it. And the speech he gave was not a in at all costs. It was quite clear about how he wants to reform Europe. And I have sympathy for lots of the things that he's setting out to do. But what I'm clear about is that we need the EU's economy to thrive, and we want to bring down the levels of unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment in other countries. We want to stop the shackles of austerity holding back other countries. But we can only achieve that if we're playing a full part at the European table. And what was striking about what happened in Greece, which I know was something that lots of people were concerned about, was that when push came to shove, they decided they wanted to stay in. And even when they were voting against the bailout, as they initially did, there was no prospect they wanted to leave the euro or the EU. And that, to me, shows the strength of that solidarity, the strength of that European ideal. And I think that those of us who are on the left would be, in a sense, undermining our own values of collective action and solidarity if we pull away.
Any more questions on the economy?
Hi, I'm quite a simple person. Just wanted to ask you, a few minutes ago you said that the EU have given us funding to do lots of different things in Manchester and so on. As far as I understand, we give them the money, and then sort of floats around Brussels or wherever. People apply for the money, it comes back to this country. But surely we're giving out more than we're getting in, so they're not giving us them, we're just giving us a proportion back of what we're getting, whereas you say it's funded by the EU, it's funded by the British taxpayer, isn't it?
So in purely taxpayer terms, you're absolutely right. Each year there's a nominal bill to the UK of about 20 billion. We get some of it back from that rebate that Margaret Thatcher negotiated. We then get transfers back for the agricultural payments and the payments for the cohesion funds to support more vulnerable parts of the country for research and investment. And then the private sector gets some money back as well in the form of grants. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies have shown that the net contribution is actually about 5.7 billion each year. But then we get a whole load back more as well, and that was one of the points I was making in my reports. But when you put together all the benefits we get from the economic arrangements we have with the EU, from that extra investment we get from being in the EU, from the extra trade that we get from being in the EU, from the lower prices that we get from being part of the single market, and how all of that bubbles together and helps our economy to grow, the estimates that the Confederation of British Industry have put together show that the average household gets £3,000 per year, as opposed to about £340 that's our net contribution that we pay out. Well, the problem with that is you can't see it. No, it's not like Juncker writes you a cheque every year for £3,000. But what we have to look at is what would we lose if we were to leave? Because yes, we would get that 5.7 billion back as a net contribution. But the Treasury says that as an economy, we would lose around 100 million, and that would mean that there would be a cut to our public services of 36 billion. Now, we can all do the maths that 36 is bigger than 5.7, so I just think it's a very narrow way of looking at it, to think purely about the taxpayer money that goes back and forth between here and Brussels. Leaving would be such a cataclysmic event for our economy that it would fall off a cliff and there would be a massive hit to public finances as well, and that would dwarf the money that we got back.
Probably should quote some people like the Treasurer, who, as far as I'm aware, have never managed to get the sums right in the first place. So.
But, I mean, people say that about the Treasury. I mean, what's quite interesting about it is they do this every month. They do a forecast of forecasters. So they look at all the different estimates are made of where GDP will be, including their own. And actually, they've got one of the very best track records of any predictor. Now, you're right. It's impossible to predict the future, and people don't anticipate everything that's coming along. But just think of the logic of leaving the EU, of losing access to the single market, our home market, of having tariffs increase, so the cost of goods increase, of seeing big international companies that invest in this country, like Airbuses and Siemens, big car manufacturers, thinking about whether they want to be here or elsewhere in Europe. All of that points in the wrong direction. So I'm sure we can quibble about what the precise numbers are. Indeed, all these studies that I cited have slightly different numbers, but they're all negative. And that, I think, is the problem. They're all negative, and they're all an order of magnitude greater than that 5.7 billion that we would lose, or that we would get back if we were to leave in terms of pure taxpayer money.
Let's get a few more questions. I'm going to group them in three.
Okay, this question is a little bit related to the last one. And in certain regions, like Manchester, have had enormous benefits from the EU, with development funds and social funds, like Cornwall and the North East. And I think the campaign has somewhat failed to connect what the EU's done for this communities, individual communities. I wonder how you're going to address that. I mean, if you look at Manchester, everything from Media City to the tram network to the eye hospital across the road, got millions from the EU. And the EU has been incredibly successful at distributing upcoming equality between regions. It's had an immense effect on that, where the Treasury and Westminster have failed. I sort of, there's been a little bit of absence of connecting what the EU's done for the regions. and whether you can say what sort of the campaign is going to do about that. And my second point was just that has David Cameron's renegotiations, which you're right, they're quite absent, do you think they've helped your campaign in a way that they've had some sort of positive influence on the way?
That's great. Let's get there.
It's the same point actually, just to follow up and to add something to that last point also. It really does depend on whether London is committed to the regions, and the European Regional Development Fund and European Social Fund is allocated to regions based on needs. So you have to think about, or it used to be, to a greater extent. But to follow up on your point, that's exactly the reason why we don't want to go back to the 80s. I mean, the phrase was on your back, regions were just left to die. And that's the difference that structural funds make to regions, which we wouldn't necessarily get through a nationally funded programme. Secondly, transnational programs. Universities have come out strongly in favour of the Horizon 2020 programme, for example. We've already talked about the benefits of Erasmus+, but pooling brains in that way and making a bigger programme for academics to work between themselves to come up with new solutions and innovation is of immense value. You can't do that on your own, otherwise you just sat there talking to yourself. No innovation comes from talking to yourself. So that's the other value of recycling funding in that way.
Let's get there.
Yeah, hi. There is a fairly compelling argument against EU membership and further engagement with Europe that you touched on when you were talking about a discontent with globalisation. And I mean, lots of young left-wing people who will quite quickly evoke TTIP and all the dangers, and it is going to form part of the narrative as the campaign goes on. How do you propose to address that?
Very good. Okay. On the regional funding, which is, I think both of you made the point brilliantly, such a critical part of the positive reason for staying in the EU. As a campaign, we do our best on this. Unfortunately, when we put out a press release saying Manchester gains X million from the EU, it's quite hard to get in. As I said earlier, the media are interested in rows and risks. So it becomes quite hard to do that, certainly to sell that positive story. But we certainly have done it as part of our social media and our volunteer programme. So actually just 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a week-long campaign where we published new leaflets for every region of the country, setting out the benefits with pictures of local landmarks that had benefited. We tried to put things into a local paper. I'm pretty sure the Manchester Evening News covered it, but frankly it might have been at the bottom of page 14. People might have missed it. So it's, it's an ongoing struggle, and we will try to return to this during the campaign. But the best way we can get the message out is by eloquent people like the two of you going out and telling your friends and colleagues. If you've got the time, joining our campaign and talking to complete strangers on a Saturday morning, at the Untitled Centre or wherever, and making sure that people understand, your reasons for wanting to stay. On the renegotiation, I actually think that substantively there was quite a lot in there that was positive. So the big substantive issue was about what happens to the single market as the Eurozone countries continue to integrate, and how Britain and other countries on the outside of the Euro could make sure that we had some safeguards. And the government achieved that. I think it's a very sensible cross-party thing to do. As a Labour candidate, I stood on a platform of restricting in-work benefits to people who are newly arrived in the country. That was something the Conservatives had done as well. There's a debate about whether that's the right policy or not. I happen to think it is, but it is what David Cameron delivered. And I think it does increase fairness into our system, and indeed many Brits going to other countries because they have more contributory systems wouldn't get access to some of those equivalent benefits immediately. And then there was this point about ever closer union. So, we do have the best of both worlds in this country, that we do have this sort of special status, as the Prime Minister puts it, with the EU, where we have managed to carve opt-outs from things we don't like the Euro, the Schengen borderless zone, while enjoying the economic benefits. I think it's one of the most compelling reasons for staying in, that we have this unique relationship. And because some people are concerned about this idea of a federal Europe, of a political union that would perhaps encroach into other areas of our policy, I think that was a sensible thing that certainly enjoys widespread public support that he delivered. Does it make a difference to the campaign? I don't know. I mean, as I say, this focus group we had this week, nobody knew it happened. And, for the months beforehand, those of us following it closely were sort of completely engrossed by it. So my sense is that the arguments are bigger than those that were in the renegotiation, but at the margin, it makes a difference. And on TTIP, this is definitely an issue for some people, and I think it's definitely been an issue for people in the trade union movement and the Labour Party, and I've spoken to lots of people about it. There are two fundamental points here. The first is that the European Commission has, I think, given some pretty clear guarantees about what it wouldn't allow TTIP to include. They have been quite clear that it wouldn't allow for the privatisation of the public services, including the health service. And in my view, it should be a complete red line for the UK to go into a trade deal with the US that would allow us to do that. But also, sometimes people talk about this investor-state dispute settlement, which is one part of it. It's caused a lot of concerns. And it's complicated. There are risks with this, which has been part of trade deals going back for decades, that multinational companies are able to essentially take democratic countries to court for the imposition of particular rights of work or environmental rights and so on. And what the European Commission has done is to actually make the way that is applied in the instance of TTIP much looser than it has been for other trade deals that have been negotiated. So actually TTIP is going in the right direction in terms of trade deals. There's probably further to go, but the Leave campaigners want us to have a trade deal with the US anyway, and they've been, frothing at the mouth about Obama saying last week that it would be to the back of the queue. So if they were to win and take us out of the EU, they would still be trying to get a trade deal with the US. It would probably be a bolt-on to the EU one anyway, and we'd have no say over how it was set. So again, I think, let's stay in the club, let's make sure we protect our own interests, including the NHS. Let's make sure that the deal is right for our country, as it must be for other countries across Europe. And then let's not forget what the trade deal is for in the first place, which is to help bring down prices for consumers and increase jobs for workers.
Okay, let's move on to the next two themes. Perhaps we can combine them, that of immigration and security. I have a question / point here, because we talked before about how positive the message from the British Stronger in Europe campaign has been. And one of the things that I always find very puzzling here is how the term immigration is often used. It's used to include East European workers coming and work here. It's used to include Syrians and others fleeing conflict from around the world. It is an umbrella term that is very problematic in the sense that East Europeans and other EU nationals who work here, they're not immigrants. They're exercising a right that is given to them through the EU treaties. In that sense, to complain about unfairness of Polish or Greeks coming to work here is the equivalent of a Greek person complaining that too many VW cars run around in Greece, or that too many, Burberry's coats are worn in Paris. So, what is it that this kind of immigration, what is it that many people in this country, including some of the members of the Stay campaign, don't make the point about differentiating things, saying that people moving and working around Europe is as fundamental, as a core principle of the European Union, as it is for goods and services to move about as well.
Yeah. Because we all know what complicated argument this is and how much anger there is. I mean, I don't know to what extent people in the audience have been out canvassing for a political party and had conversations with people. I stood in the general election in Rossendale and Darwin in East Lancashire, and there's a huge amount of anger there about immigration. And that anger has lots of different ways of manifesting itself. For some people, it's concern about how their town has changed over the years, perhaps from immigration from South Asia. For others, it's about low-cost competition for jobs from people coming from Eastern Europe. For others, frankly, it's because they've read a lot about it in the newspapers, although they've not actually seen it with their own eyes. And for some, I'm sure, it is just a form of racism, although I think that is probably a small proportion. But for whatever reason, I mean, this has become the #1 issue in the country. And, you know, survey after survey that's conducted by opinion pollsters show that this is the #1 concern. Would I like to be able to turn the public conversation on this in the remaining 8 weeks that we've got in this referendum in the way that we described? Of course. But in a campaign, you've got to conduct yourself in a way that's consistent with where people are, and you've got to try and make the bigger point. And the bigger point we're trying to make in this campaign, which I think is consistent with what you're saying, is that EU membership is a package deal. And it's a package deal which gives us the access to the single market, the free movement of goods and services, and the free movement for people in this country to go and travel, work, study, retire in other countries. And whether you like it or not, and there are lots of us, I suspect, in this room who do like the fact that we live in a melting pot with people coming from other cultures who are contributing, that we're learning from. But we have to accept that others don't. But we need to make it clear to them that this is a package deal, and that if they want to retain all the positive benefits that we get from being in the EU, those 4 pillars, those 4 freedoms of goods, services, capital and labour, are absolutely critical to being in the European Union. And my hope is that in the longer term, we'll be able to have a different conversation about immigration, be able to have more people making the points that I made in my speech about the contribution that people from other countries make to this country, about the opportunities to learn and exchange with people from other countries, and that will start to change the narrative. But we're a very long way from that, I think, and so I think it would be jeopardising the entirety of this campaign if we just try to tell people who have deeply held views about immigration that they were wrong. Instead, we have to try and help people to understand that even if they're concerned about immigration, it is better to stay in the European Union and retain all the positives that we can both agree is good.
There's a question.
What concerns me a little bit, there are approximately 6 million people who exercise their right to free movement, which are directly affected by this referendum. Of these 6 I'm not sure whether my figures are right now, I'm just guessing. 3 million EU citizens living in the UK, living in working here. About 2.5 million to 3 million Brits, British expats in the UK, living in the EU, working.
British immigrants.
Sorry?
British immigrants.
They all are directly affected, but they don't have a voice, nor don't hear anything about what the future might hold in stock for them from either the Leave campaign nor the Remainers wing. Is that an issue that can be addressed?
There was another question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. This is a question from another simple person. Can I say to you that one of the, if I may call it, the failures of the Remain campaign is you have failed to provide us with a vision that excites people as to what will happen if we remain within the EU. Whereas the Leave it said, we're going to gain our sovereignty, we're going to control our borders, we're going to bring all that money back from Brussels and spend it on the NHS. And yet we know that this is not true. Yet the Remain campaign failed to provide us with a vision of what will happen if we remain. And that is something that I think needs to be addressed if you want people to vote for the Remain. I would suggest that this is one of the things you need to address. And my second question, if I may, is you mentioned about equality and the rights of workers. Well, explain to me how it is that the EU has advanced race relations in the UK. because when my discrimination happened, all the race relations laws weren't worth the paper that they were printed on. So I would appreciate a little more explanation.
Okay, let's get one more point, and then we're going to have a second round of over there.
Yeah.
Hi, two different points actually, and the first point is on the quote which was used, a slightly disappointing quote which was used to say that low-cost Eastern European community members are coming over here, who are working, implying that they're working at a discounted rate. No, they're not. They're being exploited by companies, by other community members who have a slightly stronger understanding of the language and the systems over here. They are not given a fair wage, they're not paid overtime, they don't have employment contracts. I come from a small community organization that represents Eastern European community members, and it is slightly frustrating to hear on this platform such an inaccurate terminology. They come here to work, to have a better life, and for lots of other reasons, which they don't have to explain. Because everybody have pointed out over here, they have a right to travel without being questioned, and that's part of the EU. So that's the first point. I don't think it's accurate, and I don't think it should be repeated that it's a low-cost Eastern European labor force. The second point is, somebody made a point about having an inspiring campaign. I think that's completely accurate, and that's very, very true. How do we have inspiring campaign? Having an inspiring campaign is where you connect with the communities, where you connect with the individuals. It's absolutely fantastic to hear that this campaign has secured funds and secured expertise in social media. That's fantastic. You might have spent thousands and millions of pounds over it. That's fantastic. But at the same time, you're saying that the region-specific posters and leaflets that you created were not picked up by the media. So something's not working over there. Then our community members are stressed and they don't know what's going to happen. There are certain community members who don't keep their head, who have had workplace accidents, who can't work anymore. They don't know what's happening to them. So I think where this campaign is strongly failing is to engage with the community, is to engage with the third sector, is to engage with charities and groups who are representing the community, who have voices from within the community. So, definitely.
That's great, thanks.
Right. On your first point, I think you must have misunderstood me. I was paraphrasing the conversations I've had with people on the doorstep who are concerned about immigration. I think I said earlier that part of the problem with globalisation was there hadn't been adequate social protections to people, including the enforcement of the national minimum wage. So I think you and I could sit down and furiously agree with one another about that point. On your second, which the lady over here raised as well, in terms of positive vision from the Remain campaign, I thought Jeremy Corbyn set out a positive vision. Caroline Lucas, the Green Party leader, is on our board. She's made a number of speeches setting out a positive vision. We organised a speech with David Miliband a couple of weeks ago, where he set out a really clear vision for what the European Union can do to deal with international issues. There are members of the governments that have made what they would describe as their own vision of what they want the European Union to be. And what we'll all find is that we agree with some of those visions and not with others, because there's a number of different paths that the UK within the European Union and the European Union itself can take, because it's a democratic project and we've got a democratic government. So I don't think there is a single vision of what the EU would look like in the future. And that's why, as the umbrella group, we've not sought to do that. What we've sought to do is lay out for people, because the overwhelming thing that we hear from people, particularly those who are undecided in this debate, is that they want to understand the facts, they want information to help them make their decision, they want to know what the experts think. So we've done a huge amount to try and do that. And then we've encouraged the politicians, who will often disagree on huge amounts, to set out what their vision is for the EU in the future. And again, you know, we work within the constraints of the mainstream media that set upon us. Some of them got more coverage than others. So Jeremy Corbyn actually did get lots of coverage, and most people noticed it. Caroline Lucas probably got less coverage, and when Tim Farron from the Liberal Democrats set out his vision, he'll get less coverage again. And here's the point about engagement in communities. We're an organisation that's been going for 9 months. We've already got chapters in every part of the country. This last weekend we had 350 events right around the country. We've got thousands of volunteers. But it's dwarfed by what a political party can do at a general election with its decades and decades of experience. It's just very hard to create an organisation in that short space of time, unless people get involved. And people don't need permission from us to get involved. This is a referendum that all of us have a voice in. I'll come on to the point in a second. We all have a voice in, and certainly we all have a role to play, regardless of whether we actually have a vote or not. And you can choose if you want to use our materials, you can choose if you want to get in touch with our local campaigners. It's very, very easy to do. You come to our website, the first thing you see is a form where you can fill in and give your email address and phone number. Somebody will contact you and say, here's how you can get involved. Or you can do your own thing. Or you can just sit around the dinner table at home, or by the water cooler at work, at the school gate if you're picking up your kids, and talk about this issue, talk about why it matters to you, make it a topic of conversation, bring your passion across, bring your vision across. Because this is on a knife edge. Let's not kid ourselves. The polls, day after day, show that this referendum could not be possible, and we will only make sure we stay in if all of us who care are doing our bit. Can't leave it to the campaign I run with 100 paid members of staff. Go on.
The fact is that unless you're a British citizen, you can't vote.
You've got a voice though.
So European Union committee members can't vote at the referendum. So it becomes increasingly frustrating for them.
Well, that does relate to the question. I mean, it's a frustration, right? It would be great if people from the EU could vote in this referendum as they can in local elections. There are other groups who are concerned that if you are a Brit living abroad, a British immigrant living abroad, but you've been living abroad for more than 15 years, you can't vote. There was a debate about whether 16 and 17-year-olds should have been able to vote. I supported that, but we're all working within the constraints that we're set. We're working within the legal framework for this referendum, which is that you have to be over 18, you have to be a British or Commonwealth citizen, so actually Maltese and Cypriot and Irish voters can vote in this referendum. And if you're a Brit living abroad and have been there for under 15 years, then you can vote as well. But everybody living in this country has a voice in this debate. They have the opportunity to talk to people they know and complete strangers. And I think perhaps if you are a citizen of another EU country, then people will want to hear from you about how you've made this your home, about how the opportunity for you to be here, the friendships and relationships that you've built have been so critical. Maybe people understand that. Perhaps people then will take a different view about this debate.
As usual, we are running out of time, and we can't keep Will for much longer. We have 5 more minutes. What I suggest we do is that we take another round of questions so that people raise their points, and then you can pick up anything you want there to close. Okay? Over there.
Yeah, I'm going to be the first person who's going to declare how I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote to stay in. However, I have 2 major concerns. The first concern relates to the conduct of the campaign so far in terms of the complete lack, and I agree with a number of people who've said this, the complete lack of a positive campaign for us to stay in. And second, my second concern has been reconfirmed today that you've, on a number of occasions, criticised the anti-campaign for their inability to describe what the future would look like outside the EU. I think we all need to be honest and say that it is equally difficult, nigh on impossible, to describe what the future is going to look like within the EU. And so I think it's a bit disingenuous of you to criticise the other campaign. So those are initial concerns. I also have a concern that on occasions you've gone for the classic criticism. I mean, I've spent a very long time working at a relatively high level, although before you did, in the Labour Party, and I continue to be worried whenever I hear any campaign say oh well, it's difficult to get our message out because of the media. Now you have certain newspapers who take a very strong anti-line, that's true. But I think most people, if they look at the mass media, TV, radio, it's pretty balanced, or even one might say slightly in support. You might not see that, but I'm really quite concerned when you start doing, criticising that and saying, oh well, if we can only get behind the media, our voice would get out. I'm concerned about that. We've heard that in the last Labour campaign, and that didn't prove to be the case. I have a second major concern as well about this campaign.
Can we leave the second?
Yeah, certainly. But second issue is about any intelligence you have on the intention of undecided voters. You mentioned periodically the anti-globalisation feeling, what's happening in the US primary campaigns, the wave of rather unpleasant populism seems to be going across global politics at the moment. Is there a danger that may rear its head, and once it gets going, that populist kind, any argument against is going to be very difficult to stop? So I'm interested in what intelligence, if any, you have on undecided voters.
Any more short points, please? Yes, thank you.
We've heard quite a lot about this lack of a positive vision on behalf of the Remain campaign. I think if you look into Europe itself, you look at European leaders, and particularly someone like Angela Merkel, they have this very personal relationship with Europe and a very emotional relationship with this idea of a European dream, almost like an American dream. Has the Remain campaign chosen not to focus on that because they believe British people don't share that vision of the European dream?
Any more? Final point.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I'm rushing off to teach right now. I still want to ask this question.
Are you going to stay for the answer?
So, because of the positive message, and it really struck me very. So I'm a Pole. That's a Canadian. Luckily, I get to vote. Okay. And you kept saying this package deal about the immigration, as if the immigration is a negative that we can't turn into a positive. And I think for all of us here that are saying that we would like to hear a positive message, I would have liked you to say that actually we are wrong about the immigrants coming from the EU, that they contribute more to this system than they take. And we have so much evidence about that. So how can we just get that out there on that one issue, turning it into a positive?
And that's it.
Yeah. Well, I did say that in my speech. I said they contribute 20 billion more. I believe it, I said it. I can't make everybody on the Remain side say that if they don't want to, and if they don't believe it. And there's lots of people in this country who don't believe it. My point about immigration is that absolutely we need to talk about the benefits it's brought to this country, but we also need to make people understand the consequences of ending free movement. Because I think ultimately that's what's going to persuade those people for whom immigration is the #1 issue, but we need their votes if we want to stay in the EU. I think the best thing to do that is not to bark in their face that they're wrong about immigration, is to say, we understand you're concerned about immigration, but here are the consequences of ending free movement. Maybe if we had 20 years, we could change their views on immigration. We don't. We've got 2 months. So I'm not going to run a campaign that is telling people they're wrong, because we know what happens when you just shout at people and tell them that they're wrong. They switch off, they turn away, and they retreat into themselves. What we have to do is understand that people have a difference of opinion, but set out the very clear, and I think they are clear, consequences of leaving. And the consequences of any free movement are, we would lose access to the single market, so jobs would be lost and prices would rise. People in this country would lose the opportunity to work, travel, study, retire freely around Europe. Brits living abroad might not get access to their local public services because there'd be reciprocal arrangements, and the border could move from Calais to Dover. To me, those are all quite serious consequences. And I know from many conversations that I've had with people who are undecided in this referendum, whose votes we need, but are deeply concerned about immigration,
that is a much more effective way of winning their votes than telling them they're wrong. You shake your heads, but you go and try it. I invite you to go and talk to people who've got
literature
high...
on political behaviour, and a negative message that threatens is far less likely to win elections than a positive message that encourages.
Well, I mean, that isn't true, as we know from the history of elections.
That is true.
I'll just go for this positive point, because I actually reject the idea that we're not running a positive campaign. As I say, when you look at what we have control over, when you look at all the literature that we've put out, when you look at the speeches that Remain campaigners are giving, there is a balance between the positive messages and the risk messages. And I'm not saying for a second that we can't get in the media. Actually, we have. The Remain campaign has led the evening bulletins of the news on a number of, almost every other day for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And on the days where the other side has been on, we've had our spokespeople on as well. So we're definitely getting on the news. What I'm saying is that what the media choose to focus on are the risks and the rows. So whether we like it or not, a lot of this referendum is seen through the prism of who's going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. And they want to talk about the row in the Conservative Party. Similarly, they want to look at what the risks would be from jobs being lost or prices rising, rather than what the positives are of the jobs that are created by being in, or how prices are lower. It doesn't matter what we put in our press releases and speeches, that's just what comes out the other end. So I understand people's frustrations about not hearing positive campaign. I'm frustrated too. I write the press releases, I write the speeches, I deliver the speeches that spend more than half talking about the positives. All of you have heard that, and you can see what those arguments are. Similarly, if you take one of our leaflets off one of our volunteers in the streets, or if you follow us on social media, you will get a balance. But if you only follow the mainstream media, you won't. And unfortunately, I don't edit the TV programmes or the front page of the daily papers as well. So I feel constrained on that. I'm not moaning about it, I just feel a bit constrained on it. Was there any...
I think we might have to bring this to an end. I'm sorry, I'm aware of Will's schedule, and believe me, it's time.
Can I end on a positive note?
Of course. You miss your train.
It doesn't matter, it's fine. This referendum is incredibly close. This actually relates to your point, I did miss your point. So, whether we like it or not, my sense is that most people in this room are going to vote Remain. That's my sense. I may be wrong about that, but that's the sort of impression I've picked up. This is a Eurosceptic country that we live in, and you don't have to look at many opinion polls to know that that's the case. But we are just ahead, and we can be more ahead if all of us play our part in this referendum. And you'll have heard me today making my arguments, making my case. You'll agree with some bits, you'll disagree with others. But those of you who agree with me and agree with Jeremy Corbyn and David Cameron together, probably one of the only issues on which you'll agree with both of them, that we are stronger in this country, should know that we are in a real fight to remain in Europe. And if you care about this, make sure you get involved. We've only got another 8 weeks, I think it's 8 weeks today until the vote. All of you will be living very busy lives, but there is something that you can do, whether it's just sitting down and writing an email to all those members of your family that you know are a bit sceptic about it, or at work talking to the people who are a bit hostile, read newspapers that lead you to believe that they might not be so keen on it. Get involved in our campaign. If you're a passionate Labour person, get involved in the Labouring campaign. If you're a passionate Conservative, get involved in their campaign. Join up to movements like the European Movement. Get involved if you're a student in the NUS's campaign. Just getting involved in this referendum. And then rather than being concerned that what I'm doing isn't positive enough, you can be making your own positive case, which is actually going to amplify this message a lot better than our campaign do anyway. Because the one thing that we know from the way that politics is changing is that people listen much more to their peers than they do to politicians or newspapers or big establishment figures. So get out there and make the case, and then we can win this referendum.
Before we finish, let me remind you that on the 19th of May there is a similar event that is run at the Manchester Metropolitan University, also to encourage everybody to come outside and have a drink and a bite in our reception afterwards. And also let me, before we finish, thank the volunteers and the friends of the centre that has done great work in getting all of these organized and helping to stimulate debate there. And we are very grateful to all of you. And we hope to see you again in one of our future events. But for now, let me just take this opportunity to thank Will once again for what I'm doing.